Greetings everyone, Barrett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and I am back with another full build video. Today's video we are going to be taking a crack at the Revell F-15E Strike Eagle in 1/48 scale. Now this kit is pushing 25 years old now. It was tooled in 2000. I've built this a few times, 4 times actually, and it's not a bad kit. And I'm not going to say that very often about a Revell kit. This one is actually pretty good, especially considering it's 25 years old. Now, is it the best, F-15 on the market? Probably not. I know the Great Wall Hobby has way more detail and is more accurate for a modern day F-15E. But that said, this was less than $20 at the last IPMS show I was at. And so pretty reasonable in the terms of price, and because I've built the kit enough times, I know it well. I know what to look out for. I know where the issues are that I can tackle, and all the issues in this kit are fairly easy. Not easy, but they are correctable. And there are a few things we can do to make this a slightly more accurate to modern F-15E standards. And you saw in the box there, I have some aftermarket decals, some resin stuff, and weapons for my spare parts, because I think the biggest problem with this kit is it doesn't come with any munitions. I mean, the F-15E is known for being able to carry pretty much everything in the U.S. arsenal, and often it does, all at once. And so it's unfortunate that all it comes with is basically like 4 sidewinders, and that's it. But anyways, enough said. We're going to go ahead and jump into the build. So I'm kicking things off by getting all the parts off for the cockpit, and that's where we're going to start. But I'm going to start this kit off by screwing up. So just be prepared here. And it's unfortunate because the kit seats are actually really nice. It's only 4 parts, but I think it does a really good job of capturing the F-15 style of ejection seat, and they look really good. They've got some really sharp molded in detail and crisp, texture to the seat cushions, and so it's like they actually do a really good job here with the kit seat, and I go here and mess it up. So I just ended up spilling, literally opened that bottle right before starting this build of Tamiya Extra Thin and spilled more than half of it all over my workstation and all over half the parts for the ejection seats. So this is what a normal ejection seat should look like. And here's what happens after it's had glue spilt all over it. You can see all the details are just like mud and gross and not gonna work for me. So about a week and a half later, after I got over my fuming at myself for making that blunder, I went online, found some files, and 3D printed myself some new seats. And these are great because I think the file was about $10 US, and it comes with 2 different styles. You get the ejection seat style with the kind of the little horn things on the headrest, and then you get some without. And so it'll actually be nice because I'll be able to use this same file when I build my A10 later this year. And because it uses the same style of ejection seat. I think the A10 just doesn't have the horns on it. So for $10, I think it's a great investment, and it's got nice little details molded in seat belts, your harnesses, great little great texture on the cushions, pretty much just like the kit seat, but slightly better because it's all one part. So blessing in disguise. But I can tell you at the time, I literally started this kit, and not even 10 minutes into the kit, I had spilled my glue, ruined the seats, and I was ready to throw it out the window. But I gave myself about a week, printed the seats, and I was ready to get back into things. But at least pretty much until I got to the point where I was laying paint on the exterior, I was just kind of annoyed the whole time with this build. And I'm sure that happens to other people, it's like one bad thing kind of sets the tone for the rest of the build, or at least a good portion of the build. And that's kind of how this was, spilling the glue, ruining the seats, really kind of really put a cloud over my head with this build. And I wasn't super invested into it at this point, because even though when I started, I was really gung-ho, raring to go. and and yeah, big old clouds. Like I lost a lot of my like real drive, and then you have things like this, like the ejector pin marks on the inside of these intakes, and I was like, oh, that's gonna be so much work to get those removed. And I'd considered finding aftermarket, but it's surprisingly difficult to find aftermarket for this kit anymore. I guess being 25 years old, they just not as prevalent, and with newer versions of the kit out. Anyways, so I couldn't find any like seamless intakes on, resin intakes or anything online. So it was just kind of like, all right, I just got to buckle down and work on these intakes. I knew I wasn't going to get them perfect, but I wanted to at least get them passable. The intakes are a rather large feature on this aircraft, and they're very prominent. And the kit actually does offer you FOD covers for the intakes, but because they don't offer you FOD covers for the exhaust, I was hesitant to use them, but I knew that I always had those as a backup. They're not the greatest. They don't fit great, but if I completely ruined the intakes, or I just couldn't get them to the point where I was happy, then I at least knew I had that to fall back on. But I really wanted to go through here and try my best to make these intakes look as decent as possible. And so really the big first step was removing those huge ejector pin marks on there. But then once I get the intakes together, then the next step was like, okay, I really needed to try and blend in the seam lines on the inside to really go for a seamless look. And in the end, I get pretty close. Like in the video, it'll be hard to really see, what I leave in there, but I'd tell you in person, you'll still be able to see the seam lines somewhat, but I get close enough that I'm happy with it. So right now I'm just using some Tamiya putty thinned with lacquer thinner to run the putty down into the intake. I just found it easier to do this with the putty being a little bit more runny. And at the same time, I'm actually filling in some ejector pin marks on the inside of the burner cans. The detail on the inside of the burner cans are really nice, but Revell in their infinite wisdom put these ejector pin markings right in what would be very visible locations on the finished model. So at this point, once the putty dries, I can sand, and I'm just using some sandpaper wrapped around a piece of foam to help it try and conform to the inside shape of the intake. And it is kind of difficult because the intake transitions from a square profile to a round profile, so you do have to be a little bit careful. And it's, on one part you're sanding flat parts, another part you're sanding curved parts. So I had to try and use all the little tips and tricks I knew. Like here, I've just got some sandpaper glued to some foam, which is glued to a little wooden toothpick to help maintain some contour on the inside of the intakes there. And I just work my way progressively from really low grit sandpaper to the really high grit, or sorry, vice versa, high grit sandpaper down to low grit, and try and get that polished out. So at this point, we can go ahead and start throwing some paint onto our parts here. So I'm going to start with some Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 black, and that's going to be our main, primer layer here for everything. With the cockpit tub being the way that it is, you have to be careful to really get your paint down into the corners and the recesses. Otherwise, you'll have kind of like a shadow effect of not enough paint going down. So just be aware of that. It is kind of tight in there, but and ultimately in the end, once you get the ejection seats in there, technically you really won't be able to see it. But just for thoroughness sake, I like to get it all, make sure it's all primed evenly. Also going ahead and priming some of the wheel well parts at the same time, landing gear doors and things like that, just to kind of try and knock things all out all at once. I do, and I've mentioned this in other videos, but I really try hard to, when possible, put as many parts together and then paint, while maintaining some kind of ease in when it comes to like having to hand paint or weather or whatever those parts. But oftentimes it just makes more sense, to me at least, to have a lot of parts separate. So you'll see here I've got a lot of parts all separate on these little popsicle sticks. I have them tacked down with some poster putty or blue tack or poster tack, whatever you call it, to paint all these parts individually. I get for some people that might be a pain, but in my workflow, that's what works best, and that's what makes it easier for me in the long run to get the maximum amount of detail out of the painting process. Another thing just to make sure that be aware of when you're painting a cockpit is to do your dry fitting and see if like the insides of the fuselage halves need to be painted as well. And because that's one of those things that can be easy to forget, and trust me, I've done it a few times myself, and it's just kind of a pain to have to put more paint in your airbrush and run the compressor again, and if you forget to do it when you're doing everything else. I went ahead and hit the insides of the intakes with some Tamiya X1. This is like a glossy white, and so again, I got them to a point where I was happy. They're not perfect. If you were to inspect them with a flashlight, you could definitely see the seam lines still in there, but they're close enough. I also went through the trouble of masking off a lot of the parts for the instrument panels and cockpit details. I don't normally do that. Normally I paint it by hand, but I was inspired by some other modelers on Instagram to give it a try, and it definitely requires a lot more work, but in the end, I think it goes for a cleaner look in the cockpit and cleaner instrument panels. So I do believe it's worth it in the end, but it definitely takes a little bit of time and patience to mask everything up here. Now the main panel I ended up doing in 2 passes, mainly just because it was just easier to do the masking this way. First, I did the big multifunction displays, painted those, and then I masked off the smaller parts. It was just easier in the long run, even though it was a little bit more time consuming, and ensured less areas that needed touch up. So you can see once we remove the tape, though, I think it looks pretty good. And I'll still have to do some hand painting, like the little dials and switches, but in terms of like the actual instruments and gauges and things, I'm pretty pleased with how that looks. So with all the masking and spraying done, I can break out the paint brushes and start hand painting my details here. So what's fun about painting the ejection seats is there's plenty of pictures out there of these ejection seats with all kinds of different colors of cushions on them, and different combinations. The seat cushion would be a different color than the back cushion, and so it was fun trying to find ones that I liked, and so I ended up opting for this kind of a khaki color on the seat cushion, and then this like hunter green color on the back cushion. And the 3D printed parts have a nice texture here, so there's plenty of opportunity if you really like doing like the multi-layering type painting that you'd find on like tabletop miniatures. You could have a lot of fun painting these seats up and really going to town on the details. It's unfortunate that the bulk of the seat is black, because I find black not as fun to paint. So I'm just hitting it here with a dry brush of like a medium gray color. This is going to help pick out some of the details without necessarily, making them like adding a lot of contrast to them, but just pick them out, give the hint that you can see them, and a little bit of awareness from the rest of the black in there. So go ahead and get those all dry brushed. We'll dry brush the circuit breakers on the inside of the fuselage walls there, the back deck of the cockpit of the cockpit here, and then all the instrument panels. So this will just help, again, just like the seats, we'll pick out some of the detail and some of the edges and kind of draw your eye to them. But then we're going to go through and hand paint a lot more of the dials and switches and things. So this I'm just doing with like a light gray color, so it stands out from the dry brush, but it's not quite as stark as like a white would be. And so for all of my brush painting, I use Vallejo acrylic colors. They're specifically their model range. There are a few colors that I'll pick from like their game color range, but for the most part, their model range has everything I need. And when you're doing this type of hand hand painting with a brush, you really have to kind of practice thinning your paints, because if it's too thick, you just kind of end up globbing it on and you lose a little bit of control. And I thin the paints with just normal tap water. I don't use anything special. And as far as like, I wish I could give you like a hard fast rule for thinning Vallejo paints. It's really one of those things that you just have to do. Like, you just have to practice, find what works for you, and it's kind of all by feel at this point. But you definitely need a consistency that will load into the brush and can flow easy. And so there we go. We can move on. At this point, we can move on to gloss coating everything. This isn't necessarily like a totally, have to do step. It's just a step that I've put into my process, and it's kind of become it's just another step in the way I do things, because one, it helps protect all of our paintwork that we've done thus far, but it also gives us a base to then start adding decals if we need to, and, weathering and washes and things like that. The Revell kit does not come with any decals for the instrument panel, so any detail that you want to put on the instrument panel, you have to paint by hand or purchase aftermarket decals. But they do come with decals for the ejection seats, which is nice because there are a few prominent placards on the ejection seats, and they look kind of bare without them. But once the decals are done, we can move on to doing a bit of a panel wash, or a pen wash, if you will, to the parts. This is just going to help kind of do the opposite of what we did with the dry brushing, where the dry brushing is picking out raised details. The panel wash, the pin wash here, is going to help create some depth into the recessed details. And this gets applied liberally all over the parts on the interior, especially parts that have a lot of texture, a lot of detail to them. This just helps create some depth to them. And this is the version of the aircraft that I'm doing is a heritage aircraft, so it's painted in this really vibrant heritage paint scheme. It's going to be at air shows, it's going to be going around doing demos, so it's not going to necessarily be like super worn and dirty on the inside, but nevertheless, these still are functioning military aircraft, and they are going to have a level of wear and grittiness to them that the wash helps provide. So now we can get the first stage compressors painted or applied onto the intake trunks. I didn't do a lot of detail painting with these, basically just painted them aluminum and called it good, because once they're in, unless you're shining a light directly down the intake trunk, you're really not going to see them. So now we're going to seal in our pin wash with a satin coat. This is going to be our final varnish layer for the interior. Didn't want to go dead flat with this, just wanted to have a little bit of a sheen to it. So satin has become kind of my favorite go-to finishing varnish at this point, unless the aircraft that I'm building specifically has like a dead flat finish. And in fact, this aircraft, the actual exterior part does have a dead flat finish, and you can see that in pictures of the real aircraft. So I don't use it there, but for the interior parts, I do use the satin finish. So now that we've applied the satin finish and we're not going to be doing any more spraying on the interior parts, I can go ahead and use some UV curing clear resin to represent the glass portion of the instrument panels. And so this gets applied to all of the MFDs and all of the dials and gauges. And I like using the UV curing resin over like a gloss paint for this portion, because I've always found that like when you first apply like a gloss paint onto instrument panels, they look really nice and shiny, but then once it dries, you kind of it dulls down a little bit. But not so with the UV curing resin. Like basically how it looks when you apply it is how it's going to look when it's cured, and I'm really pleased with how these turned out. I think they look great, and just the right look that I'm going for. So now we can go ahead and start actually like assembling our cockpit a little bit. The instrument panels go in, and there's like very positive locating tabs that they fit into, so no question on where they're supposed to go or how they're supposed to fit. Fit here was great. You can see they slot into a portion on the floor, and then the instrument panel rests on those two little tabs. So there's a little combing piece here that we do for the back seater's instrument panel, We can get the control sticks installed. And again, just like the instrument panel, like very positive slot that they slot into on the floor. So there's very little mistake on how they're supposed to go in and where they're supposed to go. So, I mean, for, out of the box plastic cockpit from 2000, like, I think it looks pretty good, even without decals. And of course, we have to have our obligatory, quality inspection from the void here. And I'm going to assume that that's approval. So we'll go ahead and move on. Another thing that I wanted to play around here with was doing the very unique exhaust patterns on the inside of the afterburner cans. Well, or the exhaust nozzles. I guess technically they're not afterburner cans. The afterburner portion sits further in the engine exhaust, but colloquially, well, I cannot say that word. The kind of the common vernacular is these are the afterburner cans. Anyways, my goal here was to replicate some very unique wear patterns that you find on the inside of these things, and I kind of had some inspiration from some fellow modelers on Instagram, and so I was trying out some various things, and I got pretty close to what I wanted. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but I got close. So anyways, I'm using various paints. You saw me using a Citadel shade there that I thinned and sprayed through the airbrush for this kind of like rusty brown color. Then I'm using some black from Outlaw Paints. And here I've got the tape on because there's these really interesting like reverse delta patterns that I noticed on not all but some of the inside veins of the engine nozzles. And so I'm trying to replicate that here, and I get close. A few of the parts don't look too bad. Some of them didn't quite turn out the way I wanted, but nevertheless, like, it's always fun to try and experiment with new techniques and new processes. So in terms of like as an experiment overall, like, I'm pretty happy because these are definitely techniques and skills that I can use on other projects. Did it exactly match the vision in my head? Not quite, but I feel like it came pretty close. And once the cans get put together and then in combination with like the rest of the model, I'm actually pretty pleased with how they look in the end. And so I'm excited to show you further, like later on in the build, how those turned out. But we'll go ahead and get some wash on the interior of the landing gear doors here. Applying this pretty liberally all over. And what the nice thing about the wash is, or at least with this wash, is when you apply it over a good solid gloss coat, any excess can just be wiped away with a Q-tip or paper towel once it dries. And drying time is usually about less than 30 minutes, depending on how how much you apply. If you apply a lot, then it will take a little bit longer, but otherwise it actually goes on pretty easy and then removes pretty easy. The nose wheel well gets attached to the underside of the cockpit, which is nice because it helps with aligning it inside the fuselage halves, but the fit here wasn't like stellar. There was a lot of like wiggle room in how the parts fit, and it took me a little while to kind of get things where I needed them. And you'll notice here that the rear door is actually attached to and part of the interior of the wheel well. And I quickly realized that this was going to be a problem and a pain for painting later on. So eventually I actually do clip that off and remove the door and keep it separate. So next up, we're going to actually start putting the fuselage together. That's going to start by doing the nose section. So the nose section is separate, and we have to fit the cockpit into the nose section. Fortunately, there are some rather large, nice locating tabs. So it's pretty easy to get it aligned in there. But like I mentioned before, having the actual door attached here is just going to cause problems. One, for sanding seams, filling seam lines, things like that, but also just in the painting process of having to mask that and paint it. It was just going to be too much of an issue. So we remove that. We can move on to getting things glued up. I start by applying a little bit of glue to the inside or to the edges of the cockpit tub where I wouldn't be able to get glue in later on. And then it's just a matter of getting the fuselage halves together. So you can see here I'm using some alligator clips here to help things out a little bit, to get the very top part to sit together flush. And then we can use some tape as well to hold everything together while we glue it. And I obviously you can see here that the overall fit of the two fuselage halves was okay-ish at best. It wasn't like 100% great, but I've definitely seen worse. And I'm also going to take this time to pre-mask the insides of the intake trunks. I've found this to be the easiest way to do this, kind of pretty much, at least so far with all the jet builds that I have done, is to mask off this portion, like the white portion of the intakes, prior to getting them installed, because trying to mask these off while they're like buried deep in the fuselage is just beyond my skill. And so this works better for me. And then basically what I do is I only need to mask off the very lip of it, and then as you see here, I'm inserting foam into there, and that fills in the rest and protects the rest of it. And that's easy to remove, down the road. Getting the Vulcan 20mm gun barrels installed there, I had considered like opening up that whole little gun bay area, because it's kind of neat to see the whole rotary gun system in there, but ultimately I wanted to try and keep the jet itself as clean as possible, and not have a lot of stuff opened up, mainly because I would have to do it would just kind of help break the lines. So with the fuselage halves together and cured, I can go ahead and start sanding the seams. They weren't too bad to sand. I mean, there were some fit issues with the fuselage halves here, but honestly, once I got the parts together, they actually went together really well. Here's one tip for the Revell F-15. If you cut off a length of sprue and insert it pretty much where I have it shown here, to create a little outward force, it'll help fit the nose portion to the rest of the fuselage much better, and cause you way less work later on in the build. So, I mean, and you'll need to test fit like the front part of the nose to the fuselage to see how much of that sprue you need in there to push out. It's not very much, but just be aware it will help things fit better in the long run. So right now I'm just getting the main body, top and bottom, together with some tape. It'll just help maintain the alignment and make gluing a little bit easier. Another tip with the Revell F-15 is the fact that the upper wing is not continuous all the way across from left to right. It has like a separate panel. And if you use the locating pins that are supplied in the kit and get the lower panel fit in there, you can see here that you end up with this really large gap. And it's ugly. Like, it's nasty. So what you need to do to do this fix, and it's, like I said, it's really straightforward and simple. You have to start off by removing the locating pins on the lower portion of the wing. You have this one at the front here, and that's really the only one that you need to worry about. And then what you need to do is you need to file down the very outboard edge of the lower wing portion, and try and keep this as square as possible. Don't do too much at the front or the back. You want to try and keep it as square as possible to the inboard edge there. But we only need to remove like the tiniest amount of material on here, because all we're trying to do is bring the upper portion of that outboard wing section into the center section a little bit more. I hope that makes sense the way I'm explaining it, but you can see what I'm doing here. So you just need to file that edge in, because that's just going to allow that top portion to sit a little bit closer to the inboard section of the wing. We also need to file down this edge because it's actually not totally vertical. It kind of toes out at the bottom a little bit. So if you file down the bottom edge of that mating surface there, it'll make everything fit much better. So now the second thing you're going to need to do is actually glue the top two portions of the wings together first. Don't glue them. The instruction would have you glue that outer portion to the bottom part of the wing and then glue the whole section to the fuselage. Don't do that. Glue this section first. Make sure you have a nice good fit between those two sections. Eliminate that gap, squeeze it together a little bit, make sure that it's flat and it's flush, and this is going to give you a much better result. Make sure you're using ample glue. You want this joint to be nice and solid. And then once you have it aligned, once it's cured and dried, then you can go ahead and install the lower part of the wing. Now, if it doesn't completely fit, you might have to, fine tune some filing on that outboard edge here, just like I'm doing here. But this is where you want to be making your modifications to, not the upper surface, because then it'll just be a pain to have to clean up any issues with the upper surface. But there we go. Honestly, the modification does not take very long. Once everything's cured, it's invisible, but it gives you a nice, good, flat, seamless upper surface without having huge gaps up there. So I hope that works out for you. So now we can go ahead and get the nose section installed. And like I said, you need that spacer in there to help push out against the upper portion of the fuselage there, and you get an almost seamless fit there. So otherwise, what ends up happening is the nose section is slightly narrower than the back portion of the fuselage, and so you end up with like a step there, and it's pretty ugly. The design, the markings that I chose for the fourth fighter wing has this really cool like flaming arrow design that goes on to the air brake, which is this part that I'm installing right now. And if the air brake is deployed and extended, it breaks that flaming arrow. So I decided to have the air brake in the closed position. But you can see here, as I was installing it, I ended up dropping a huge glob of extra thin on the fuselage. Now, this is going to end up being a good teaching moment, because your reaction, your initial gut reaction is to be like, oh, I got to wipe that off. But if you do that, you're going to give yourself way more of a headache. The best thing to do is just to let it dry, let it cure, and then sand it out. And the reason why I say don't wipe it is because you're just going to end up smearing that glue and plastic over a larger area, and you're just going to have more surface area that you have to sand out and clean up and rescribe. And so if you just leave it as a drop, as a puddle, as a spot, and then you just have less that you have to sand out and clean up. Because honestly, once it cures, it will sand out pretty easily. I'm not even using like super low grit sandpaper there. So just work through your grits of sandpaper until you can kind of polish that back up. Here I'm using my little scribing tool to clean out the panel lines and to sharpen those up a little bit. And basically by the end, you won't even know it happened. Now, if you do this on a model that has like tons of surface detail and rivets and things like that, you're going to have a little bit more, work ahead of you, but it's definitely not the end of the road, and it's a recoverable error. So once you start getting paint down on this, like you won't even know that it was there. So yeah, don't panic if you drop glue on your model like that. Don't panic. Just leave it alone, let it cure, and then you can sand it out, and it's almost like it was never there. So now we can go ahead and build up the actual like intakes of the aircraft. It's a 2-part piece. I wished that Revell had given you the option to have the intakes lowered. The F-15 has these like variable incident intakes that lower and raise depending on the angle of attack of the aircraft. And normally what happens when the aircraft is parked, I believe they are hydraulically operated, and so the hydraulic pressure bleeds out and the intakes end up drooping into the down position. And it kind of looks pretty cool when they're down, but I didn't want to go through the trouble of trying to like modify and scratch it. So we're just going to go ahead with them in the up position and get those installed. Now, I haven't shown this recently, and I'm going to really try hard to be better at showing this, but I had a fan of the show make me some custom hammerhead model making decals. And I usually put one on all the builds that I do, obviously hidden somewhere. So I need to be better about showing that so you guys can see where those are. But I also wrote in there on the inside of the conformal fuel tank here that this is part of a Screaming Eagles buddy build and the date. So now you know it's there. And if this ever ends up on the market somewhere, you'll know that it's a genuine hammerhead build because it's got the hammerhead decal inside. So here I'm working on getting the instrument combing panel, whatever you call it, built up and painted before I can fit the main canopy on. And so what I initially did was just I was getting parts fitted and then test fitting the canopy to see how it was going to fit, to see if there was going to be any issues with the canopy, bumping into something and what all I needed to paint. So I get it painted black. Then we're going to hit it with a little bit of our neutral gray dry brush, just like we did to the rest of the cockpit. And this is going to help just pick out some of those details, add a little bit of distressing to this part. This part is constantly in the direct sunlight, so it's going to see a little wear. Now, another thing I wanted to try with this build was the effect that you see on the heads-up display glass of like this kind of holographic type color shift effect. And so I played around with using some holographic nail foil and UV curing resin to get the effect that I want. And in the end, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So basically, I just cut out a little section of the holographic film, apply a small drop of UV curing resin to the outside surface of the heads-up display piece, and then carefully trim away the excess foil. It's not foil; it's more of a film. It's sold as a foil, but and it's funny because this is used for like nails, women's nails, and but I think it looks pretty good on the heads-up display. So we'll go ahead and get this installed. I'm actually going to be installing it with some UV curing resin so that I don't, I could use some model cement or super glue to install that, but that runs the risk of fogging or marring the clear part. So we'll just go ahead and get that installed with some UV curing resin because that doesn't hurt the clear part at all. And once it's installed, again, we're going to check the fit of the canopy, make sure that it doesn't interfere with the heads-up display, and we can go ahead and cure that and call it good. I'm really pleased with how this turned out, and it definitely gives the effect of that holographic look. Finally, I'm just going to by hand paint the little frames of the heads-up display with some black paint, and then obviously you have to be really careful here. We don't want to get paint onto our nice holographic effect there, but yeah, in the end, really happy with how that turned out. Definitely looks the part, and it's quite unique, and I hope like once the model is done and it's sitting there, like that'll stand out. So the part that I'm putting here, these are called conformal fuel tanks, and so this is one of the things that gives the F-15E its longevity and its long loiter time. Is these massive fuel tanks they put onto the side of the aircraft, and if you look at the real one, they have this like what I assume is some kind of like rubber seal or gasket that runs around the whole edge. And so my attempt here is with this Vallejo plastic putty is twofold. One, to fill in the gaps between the part, the fuel tank part and the fuselage, but also to kind of, partially replicate that rubber gasket that would go around the whole perimeter of the fuel tank here. And so the way that this stuff works on, you apply it on, once it's dry, then you use like a wet Q-tip or something, and you can gently work away and rub away all the excess putty and leave some into the gaps. Next up, we're going to be working on the canopy and the exhaust. Now, the Revell kit has some old technology in it, which results in this somewhat prominent seam line in the main canopy, and that's just not going to do. So we got to take care of that. So I'm going to start off by gently scraping away the raised portion of the seam with a fresh X-Acto blade in my hobby knife, and really just trying to make sure that all I'm getting is that seam. Obviously, you're going to get a little bit of plastic around it. It can't be helped, but this is just going to eliminate the actual raised portion of the seam, and then the rest of the work is just going to be done to clean up and polish out the marks we are leaving on the clear part. Now, this is one of those things where I put off learning how to do this for a long time because it always was just nerve-wracking taking a knife blade or sandpaper to my clear parts, because what happens if you don't do it right and you mess up? Well, so what I'm going to do now is gently with some water just wet the canopy, and I'm going to start sanding and really just applying a little bit of pressure, not a lot of pressure, just doing these nice little circular motions. And this is going to start our process of cleaning up and polishing the portion of the canopy that had the seam line. And go back and forth a few times, and you want to make sure that you're always doing this with water and wetting it down, and you don't want to be doing this dry. I think it's just going to make your job a little harder. So we're going to go back and forth over this a couple of times, and you can kind of change up the way that you're sanding. I initially start out with some like circular motions, then we can do more linear motions, things like that. Now I'm upping the grade of the sandpaper. Originally started off with 1500, now I'm at 2000, and again still going with water to wet sand this. Now I'm going to bump up to 3200 using a sanding sponge or a sanding pad, and I'm just going to slowly start working my way up the chain of grits. So now we're at 3600. And usually what I will do is wipe the canopy off in between grits, just remove a lot of that excess material and put fresh water on. Now we're at 8,000, and you can see here that the canopy is starting to polish up a little bit. It's starting to clear up a little bit. And now we're up to 12,000. So this is going to be like my last sanding polishing buff, and before we move on to the actual plastic polishing stuff. But I mean, this gets us pretty close. The 12,000 grit does a pretty good job of getting it most of the way, like 90% of the way there. Now we're going to switch over to using some polishing compounds. So I'm going to start out with the coarse compound, and what we do is we just apply a fair amount to the canopy. And then I'm just going to use a cotton bud to gently work on our seam line here and polish this up. And you could also use like a lint-free tack cloth kind of a thing, but on small parts like this canopy, I usually find that the Q-tip, the cotton bud, works pretty good. And so we'll go ahead and clean that all off. We're even getting really close there, and now we're going to hit it with the fine polishing compound. Now, obviously, I'm using the Mr. Hobby. I know Tamiya makes polishing compounds. I'm sure there's other polishing compounds out there that would work just as well. But so use whatever you have available to you. These are just the ones that I happen to have on hand. So now we're going to go over the whole thing with the fine polishing compound, give it a clean off, and there we go. We're pretty much back in business. So seam line removed on the canopy, and now we can move on to the engine nozzles. So here you have to... Normally the instructions would have you install these parts into the actual like exhaust cone, but because I wanted to paint these separately, I attempted to use some tape to put it together first, so it was kind of a little bit of a juggling act there to try and get those all together and lined up properly, and then use the tape to hold them together, and then I can set them into the exhaust tube to just register that they're the correct shape. But now we're going to go ahead and clip off all of the parts for the actuators of the exhaust. And there are a lot of these. There's a lot of little parts here, but I think this is one of the great things that helps the exhaust to be as detailed as possible. And so one of the features of the F-15E is they essentially removed what they call the turkey feathers on the exhaust nozzle. So these are pieces of metal that would normally cover these actuators and kind of streamline the whole engine can. And I don't fully understand the reason why they remove them. I don't know if it's like a maintenance thing. It's just easier to maintain the engine if you don't have to keep pulling those covers on and off. But it exposes a lot of the mechanical guts of the engine nozzles, and it just looks really cool. But it's a very prominent feature on F-15Es. A lot of the earlier model F-15s, they had the turkey feathers on, so they were much more like streamlined, more like what you'd see on an F-16 or a late model F-14. But yeah, so there we go. Engine nozzles are done and ready for paint. I went ahead and masked the inside of the canopy windows because just something, I was going to have the canopies open. They're pretty large and very visible canopies, and it just looks better to have the inside masked off and painted. It is a lot of work, and you have to be careful because there's no like raised portions to mask against. So you just kind of have to take it slow and really pay attention to what you're doing. But the hard work, I think it is worth it in the end, because it really gives you a nice look for the inside of the canopy, especially if you're going to have the cockpit open, like I mentioned, and you'll be able to see in there and see that. So there we go. Inside, painted and ready to install. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and install the canopy, the windscreen, onto the jet. So what I'm doing here is applying the glue first, let it sit, let it start to evaporate a little bit, and then install the clear part. And what this is going to prevent is that extra thin glue wicking up into an area that you don't want it to, and potentially smudging the inside of your canopy, which would just be bad. And it's definitely something that I've done on previous builds and wanted to avoid on this. So I'm happy to report that it worked out pretty nice. So now we can go ahead and mask the outside of the canopy. And for this, I'm using this really narrow, this is like 1.5 millimeter, 2 millimeter Tamiya tape. And basically just going to go around the edge of what would be the canopy framing. And if you're going to be doing any kind of cutting around clear parts like this, always make sure you're using a fresh, sharp blade, so that you reduce the chance of the blade slipping or gouging out your plastic and then having to go through the whole process of polishing it out and cleaning it up. And yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the canopy with this blue masking tape. And so there we go. That's the whole canopy all masked up and ready to go. And originally my intention was to have the canopy on the aircraft while I did all the painting, but that ended up not working out, and we'll show you later. So now I'm going to start moving on to working on Ordinance. And one of the things that I love about the F-15E, and one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite aircraft, is you get all kinds of different weapon loadouts on this thing. And oftentimes you will get asymmetrical loadouts. And I'm a huge fan of asymmetrical loadouts. So basically like different types of bombs on different types of ordnance on different sides of the aircraft, that it's not like even. I also went ahead and purchased an Edward resin sniper pod. So the kit comes with the old version of the targeting pod, and that's just not used on current F-15Es. And so what I'm doing here is removing, and because of the way that Revell molds the part, you have to, because you need the pylon, the Edward kit doesn't come with the F-15 pylon for the sniper pod, so you have to use the pylon that it comes in the kit, but you have to remove the old targeting pod off of that. And so that's what I'm doing here, is just trying to remove all that old plastic of the old targeting pod. Then we are left with the pylon itself. We'll have to do some cleaning up on there, but at least it gives us a base to start with. Here are the drop tanks. So this will be carrying 2 drop tanks under the wing stations. So you can see why the F-15E has such great loader time, because it's got these 2 massive drop tanks on each wing, and then the conformal fuel tanks on the fuselage itself. So huge fuel capacity. Going back to the Edward resin sniper pod here, you have to remove this portion from the casting block. And fortunately, they give you like a about 2 millimeters worth of resin that you can cut through, so you really don't have to worry about cutting into the actual part itself, but you will have to clean that up, obviously, in order to present it. But this little piece goes on the top or the bottom, I can't remember. Then you have the actual seeker head, like the optical portion of the sniper pod. And you can see here that just how precise the Eduard engineering is, that as that would rotate, it would fit under the little cradle that it would normally sit on with like perfect precision. So what's nice is you can actually position the sniper head pod, or the sniper pod head, in any direction you want. And so that makes it really nice. So once we get the head on, then we can get the cradle on. So this is kind of like the mating surface that attaches the sniper pod to the pylon. And so we get that installed, and now that we've got our pylon cleaned up, we can get the whole unit here attached to the pylon. And this is all being glued with super glue, by the way, because you can't use Tamiya extra thin on the resin. It just doesn't work. It's meant for plastic. So a tiny little piece of photo etch here going onto the back of the sniper pod. And yeah, so this sniper pod is really nice, very, very detailed. I use this same sniper pod on the B1 kit that I built last year, and yeah, it's pretty nice. But so this is really kind of the major thing that you have to do to the Revell kit if you want to upgrade it to a modern F-15E. You got to ditch the old targeting pod and get a sniper pod. And I mean, you don't have to go with the Revell one. There's other options out there. The last little bit of detailing I'm going to do to the sniper pod is just these, like, I assume they're kind of either strengthening pieces or like lugs for attaching the pylon to the aircraft frame. And here you can see I've got my Ordinance prepared, and I can start working on pylon work on the aircraft. So another thing you'll notice here on the aircraft is I've gone ahead and painted along some of the prominent seams and panel lines to make sure that all of my prep work was done earlier is still looking good. So that's why you see portions that are painted black. But we can get all the pylons installed. Kind of a lot of work, but it looks cool in the end. So I'm going to work on getting the landing gear all built up so that we can get these ready for painting. Out of the box, they're okay, not too bad. You could go to town really detailing these up with brake hoses and cabling and wires and things like that. But they're pretty decent out of the box. Getting one of the landing lights installed, the instructions do not give any clear indication on how or where the landing lights are supposed to be installed on the nose strut. So you really have to rely on reference pictures to make sure that you're getting them in the correct spot. I'm not 100% sure that I've got them correct. I think I got them pretty close. There's also this little detail that I wanted to add to the nose gear strut that isn't present on the kit, but was present on all of the reference pictures that I looked at this airframe. And it's this little like protruding part that sticks out from the front of the nose gear strut. I assume is some sort of like shimmy dampener or something for the nose strut, but it was pretty prominent, pretty significant. So I wanted to make sure I replicated that here, just with a little length of styrene rod and then a glob of UV curing resin on the end to create the shape that I want. For the main struts, you have to add the scissors there and a couple of like side braces. And it helps when adding some of the side braces to actually drop the landing gear into the fuselage so you can get all the multiple points of contact lined up and just make sure that it's all aligned and looking right. This tiny little, I'm not sure what it would be called. This was a little challenging, again, because there's not like a real like solid definitive location where it needs to be installed, but got there in the end. So now what I'm going to do for the actual landing lights is I'm going to paint the back side of them with some liquid chrome. And the goal here is to create a reflective surface that you'll be able to see from the front. So you'll look through, you'll see the front of the landing light, and you'll see this nice bright reflective surface on the inside. And then what will happen is, as we go through our normal paint process, this will get primed and painted, and the chrome stuff will get covered up on the outside, but you'll still be able to see it through the front lens. And the effect in the end is really nice. Obviously, you will have to mask up the landing light, so I'm going to use some Ammo MIG liquid mask here. And really just the nice thing about this, you just kind of blob it on, and because of the viscosity of the liquid mask, it holds like a nice circular shape well. So you just have to make sure you get enough on there, but eventually it just kind of fills out enough to mask off the lens of the landing light. And so yeah, pretty easy, and in the end, it's going to be worth the little extra effort to do that. So for the actual wheels, I am using some res kit wheels, and it's kind of a pain, the casting block that they come on, because you have to like cut those out. But I figured it'd be easier to drill the mounting hole while it was all on the block right now, rather than try to do it when they're separate. So I used my old airbrush needle to kind of punch a center hole, and then I could use my little micro drills there to drill out the hole that I would use to attach it to the landing gear later on. So now the actual tires themselves have to be removed from their casting blocks, and you can see there's quite a lot of contact there that has to be cleaned up. And then there's a thin membrane on the inside of the wheels that needs to be removed as well. And I'm not really sure what the best way of going about removing it is, so I just used like an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill a decent sized hole in the middle, and I'm just going to use my knife to try and carve it out. Kind of a pain, but at least at the time I was kind of at a loss for what else to do to get that out without damaging the wheel and ruining it, because you need to have that obviously open, because you have to be able to put the wheel hubs in the center. But one of the nice things about the res kit tires is you get all the great like sidewall detail and lettering on it that you don't get on the plastic kits. Plus you get nice tread that obviously isn't present on the plastic parts. So now we're going to go ahead and get these mounted. I just drilled a small hole through the very bottom. These tires are weighted, so there's a definitive bottom. And I just super glue a little piece of wire on there. It'll help to make that easy to paint. And here you can see we've got all of the hubs already. And we're at a point now where everything is ready for paint. So moving on, we're going to start priming everything with our Mr. Surfacer, Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. And we're going to go ahead and get this applied all over. I've kind of over-thinned this a little bit. I want to maintain a nice smooth finish, and so I've gone a little thinner than normal, which means that there's going to be some areas where I have to, probably need like two coats, but because it's so thin, that's not going to make a huge difference, but it'll just help maintain a nice smooth finish in the end. And there's a couple areas like the back end of the aircraft that we definitely want as smooth as possible, because we have to lay down some metallic paints. Otherwise, pretty straightforward, getting the whole thing nice and primed. You can see here that I have not added the rear canopy to the aircraft like I mentioned before, and it was just getting the canopy wasn't fitting well enough that I would be happy with it on there during painting. And so I just ended up taking it off, masking over the cockpit, and just painting the canopy as a separate element. The the nice thing about having the jet here with without the exhaust cans installed is that I can actually I can stick my fingers in those to hold the aircraft and get it all painted without having to touch any of the other surfaces. So once we're all primed, and I also primed everything else at the same time, all the ordnance and the pylons and stuff, we can go ahead and start getting paint now. Now, the paint scheme that I chose is a heritage paint scheme. And what's interesting is that there's quite a few pictures of it online where you can see that it has all the pylons on, it actually has dummy ordnance on. And what's cool is that all the pylons and like the targeting pod, things like that, are basically pulled from just normal Air Force inventory. So they all maintain the gunship gray color on them. The drop tanks are gunship gray, the main pylons. And So it was kind of fun to have this like really cool, brightly painted aircraft, and then just like regular inventory pylons on it. The nose cone itself as well is also the normal color, and then these little panels on the side here, and what my goal here was to try and create a little outline here with the pen, following the panel line, so that I could mask off this panel, and so that I could protect it while painting the rest of the aircraft. And you can see here that it didn't quite work out the way I wanted to, because when I removed the tape, it removed some of the paint. So kind of a pain. I did eventually mask that off with regular masking tape for whatever. I thought the cellophane tape was not going to pull off the tape or the paint, but unfortunately it did. I am going to mask off the nose cone here. So just using that thin Tamiya tape to get the main demarcation line, and then I'll just come in with my normal masking tape to finish painting that off, or covering that up. So here are the replacement masks that I made, but I basically use the same process. I also have to do this tiny little circular panel up here. I don't know if that's an antenna or like a GPS thing, but it was painted separately. Now the actual paint scheme on this uses RAF colors, so we're going to go ahead with some RAF paints here from Tamiya, and the underside is this RAF light gray. So I'm just painting like the doors, all these little vents excuse me, that go on the outside of the aircraft, all the little pieces that need to be done, and then we can go ahead and start painting the actual aircraft itself. And so it's unusual to see like such a multicolor camouflage paint scheme on an F-15 like this, especially with, I'm not 100% sure the progeny of this specific heritage scheme and why it uses RAF colors, but the instructions specifically call out, the instructions for this paint scheme specifically call out RAF colors. So now we're doing this dark gray on top, and you'll notice here that I'll paint a little bit and then I kind of pause, and you see my hand just kind of floating there, and I keep painting, and that's because what I'm doing is just off screen I have the paint pattern, the camouflage pattern, and so I'm trying to I'll paint a little bit and then study the pattern, paint a little bit more, study the pattern, just to make sure that I'm getting it as close as possible. I'm not going to get 100% accurate, but I definitely want to try and get close, because this is a one-off aircraft. If this was something like painting a Spitfire and they used the same painting pattern, but there might be tiny variations, that's fine. But because this is a one-off, I really wanted to try and get as close as possible to the actual full-scale aircraft here. And so that's just why you see me occasionally pausing and not doing something for a minute, just because I'm off studying the instructions to make sure that I'm doing it right. So the actual camo pattern itself has a very soft edge between the two colors, and so I opted for the freehand approach here to the actual camouflage painting, which is fun. I enjoy doing this, and there are times when I'll do like a freehand camo job on something that probably was painted with stencils or at least patterns, but it's fun. I enjoy it. So now we're going to move on to the dark green, and this is really where this paint scheme comes alive. You have the great dark, like the RAF dark green, the RAF dark gray, this great camo pattern that you'd see like on an old Spitfire kind of a thing, or like a Typhoon or something. And so it's cool to see it on here, and they're great colors, and they go together really well. So again, just constantly checking the pattern reference. I went and downloaded a whole bunch of pictures online of this specific airframe, so that I could see it from all different angles, because there's a few areas where the instructions don't really quite give you a good idea of how like a part of the camo pattern transitions from one side of the aircraft to the other, or from the bottom to the top. So it was helpful to have some reference pictures of the actual aircraft, so that I could go through and really like hone down how this paint scheme looks. And it's really interesting, because it's not like you see here, like they got this big band of green running across the spine of the aircraft and then over onto the wing. That's unique, I think, and interesting. And so that's what you'll also notice, that I've got like big areas of the upper wings that I don't have any paint on. That's just because those parts are going to get painted with invasion stripes, and so didn't really need to paint over those sections with the camouflage portion. as they'll just get painted over anyways. Now we can go ahead and remove these masks so you can see that nice gunship gray color underneath there. So it's fun having so many different colors on a modern aircraft like this. And I think that's where U.S. naval aircraft kind of have a slight edge over U.S. Air Force aircraft, just because the Navy aircraft, especially the CAG birds, visually they're just a lot more interesting to look at. So, and that's one of the big reasons why I chose this paint scheme, was just to be more colorful than your standard Air Force gray. So now I've gone ahead and masked off the areas for the invasion stripes. And one of the nice things about this paint scheme that I was happy about is that it only had invasion stripes on the wings and not the lower fuselage, like that D-Day anniversary F-15 I painted a couple years ago, because that was a huge pain to have to like mask around all the pylons, and yeah, that was a pain. So this is much less intensive when it comes to the masking. It's just the wings. So now we're gonna go ahead and spray on our black. And looking at the reference pictures, these were definitely like really sharp, clean, very pristine looking invasion stripes, not the kinds that you would actually see on D-Day that were painted with paint rollers and mops and things like that. So definitely going for the nice crisp look here, and demasking was extremely satisfying, showing off these lovely invasion stripes. So here we go, all the masking removed, and yep, really enjoying that. So now we're going to go ahead and, using some of our gunship gray again, we're going to hit some of the leading edges of our flying surfaces. There, again, this is something that's not called out in the instructions for the actual paint scheme, but looking at the pictures of the actual aircraft, it looks like all of the leading edges of the wings, the tail, the horizontal stabilizers, and the very fronts of the intakes all kept that gunship gray color. And I initially considered not doing it, but in the end, I figured like it's a cool detail. It would be worth it to do it in the end. So now I get to do the part that I was really looking forward to for pretty much since the very beginning of this project, and that's painting the metallic parts for the engines. And it's a very prominent thing on F-15s is all the hot area, the engine exhaust area is kept in a natural metal, and you get a lot of cool like color distortion and different effects on the metal depending on where it sits on the engine itself. And so I was really looking forward to this. So I'm starting with a nice gloss black base to do all my metallic work on, and then I'm using this Ammo Mig A-Stand paint, which is essentially a rebottle of Alclad. So this is a lacquer-based paint, and if you've used Alclad before, this will be nothing new. And so we're going ahead and spray this on. This is out of the bottle neat, so no thinning, and spraying at about 12 to 15 psi, and you just slowly build up the layers, and you start to get this really nice shine to it, this nice reflectiveness to this paint, and really happy with how that's turning out. And obviously you have to be careful. Alclad is not necessarily known for being like extremely durable, so you do have to be a little careful. But so now we're going to go ahead and paint up the exhaust portions as well with the aluminum. Now these would normally be a much darker color, so we're going to supplement that with some Vallejo steel, and we're going to use the steel also to kind of do a little bit of post shading on the metallic work. And I'm using Post-it notes here as a simple masking tool. Post-it notes have very low tack, and so they really don't run the risk of pulling paint up with the Post-it note, but it gives us a good way to create some nice like post shading effects along some of these panel lines, and there we go. So you can kind of get these nice effects here, and then we're going to do some more work on this as well. So just a little bit of additional panel shading, or post shading with the Vallejo steel. There was these really neat like I don't know how to describe them, like heat effects on some of these engine panels where either lines of rivets would be or whatever to create these color distortions and these hue distortions on the metallic parts. So now we're going to go ahead and get the engine cans mostly overcoated with the steel color as well, just to darken them up a little bit. And because they were generally much darker than the rest of the engine area. And then now I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade. This is a Citadel, like essentially wash, and I'm going to thin this down pretty heavily. And I've turned my PSI way down, like lower than 10. And I'm going to use this to essentially create like a filter. And because it's got this like nice reddish brownish color, we get these great, this just very subtle tonal variation in the metallic color. And this is definitely something I've been wanting to try. I've used Citadel shades for other metallic work, but nothing this large before. And I'm really pleased with how it turned out, how it looked. It was definitely like I was getting the exact effect that I wanted out of to create some variation there. So now with the metallic work done, we can go ahead and start removing all of our masking. There was a lot of masking for this part because I really wanted to make sure that everything was protected. But there we go. There's the hot bits done on the F-15. So couldn't be more pleased. Really, really happy with how that turned out. And we'll be able to do even more work later on with some weathering, with some oils to take it even further. But now we can move on to our landing gear, get this all painted up. And this is again using that Tamiya white that we used on like the intakes and stuff to get those all nice and coated white. Pretty straightforward. I mean, not much to really tell on those, but make sure we get all the hubs. The extra part you see on the popsicle stick there was the actuator for the nose gear door. So I almost forgot to get that built up and painted, but basically caught it at the last minute. Main wheel wells done. And now we're going to switch over to painting Ordnance. I wanted to try something different with this kit, or with this build. And because this is a heritage aircraft, and like I mentioned before, we'd be doing like air shows and demos and things like that, it would not be very realistic to have it loaded with live ordnance. And so I opted to try and do like training ordnance, like inert ordnance. And oftentimes they're painted in a blue color. And it was just something I've never done before, and I thought it would fit. And besides, there are pictures of this airframe with this type of inert ordnance on it. And so it was just kind of one of those things like, yeah, it would work out, allow me to have the heritage paint scheme, but also have a full weapon load, which I always like to see. And it works both for, the spirit of the build, but also like it was a realistic thing. There are actual images of this out there. So now everything is painted. All of my base coat work is done, and we can move on to the next stage, which is going to be decals. So before we can get the decals on, we have to go ahead and give everything a gloss coat. And for that, I will be using my tried and true Aqua Gloss Clear by Alclad. So basically everything is going to get a coat of Aqua Gloss. And just like when we did in the cockpit, this is going to protect all of our paintwork, because we've done a lot of paintwork and we don't want to risk screwing that up now. But it'll also provide a good foundation for doing our decals and eventually doing weathering. So going through, giving everything a nice good solid coat. Some areas we'll get a couple of coats just to ensure that there's no exposed paint anywhere. And this does take time, especially when you're dealing with a lot of little individual parts, all of the bombs, the pylons, all the wheels, landing gear, everything gets coated. One of the other things that this does as well is gives everything a uniform surface, moving on to the next step. And so even if something doesn't necessarily need to get gloss because it's not going to get a wash or weathering, or it's not getting decals, I prefer to still gloss everything, or to do this particular step over everything, so that the subsequent steps, whatever those might be, everything will have the same base, the same process done to it, so that it eliminates any variation in surface and things like that, when doing further techniques. So decaling is going to be pretty straightforward. So these decals are from a company called Reed Publishing, and they're extremely thin decals, like just breathe wrong and you'll break them. For the most part, I did pretty good of not breaking the decals. There are a few that I ended up breaking, but they were, relatively easy to repair. And so I'm going to go through and just kind of show you the decaling process on the tails here, because the tails are quite prominent and are really interesting on this aircraft. So on the outside of the tails, you have all your standard aircraft, Air Force markings. You have the serial number or the bureau number, things like that. Sometimes they have badges on the tail, that kind of stuff, but it's the inside of the tail surfaces that are really unique and interesting for this particular aircraft. So that's why I chose to really kind of like show you my process here. And so really what I'm doing here is, as I'm applying the decals, what I will do is apply a little bit of water to the surface, slide the decal off onto the surface, move it around. Once I've gotten it to where I want, I will apply some Solvaset here. This is going to help the decal conform to the surface, sink down into like any details, recessed panel lines, things like that. Now, I particularly enjoy using the Solvaset as my decal setting solution. It is pretty hot when it comes to decal setting solutions, meaning that if you're not careful and you apply too much, you could easily melt through your decal, especially if it's a thin decal like these Reed Publishing decals. It's very easy to accidentally melt through your decal. And there's a few that I came really close to destroying because of the Solvaset. So you have to be careful with it, but it's really nice because it'll get even some of the most stubborn decals to conform. And this is the one of the decals that I ended up breaking a little bit. You can see that jet there came off. But so these are the inside versions of the tail, and I really like the South Carolina map with the star and all the lineage of aircraft. The Colonel Don Blakesley portrait on the inside tail. And they're just really cool looking. Another fun thing, and I say fun in definitely a non-sarcastic tone, is all of the stencil data that the designers at McDonnell Douglas felt that they needed to apply on this aircraft. Now, fortunately, this isn't one of those like Japanese F-15 schemes where they have these really cool elaborate paint schemes on it, but they mask over all of the stencil data, and so you have all these just little like random squares and rectangles of stencil data in the masterful paintwork. Yeah, that would have been that sounds like a nightmare to try and do. But anyway, so once all the decals are down, I'm going to go ahead and do another layer of gloss over the decals. This is going to help seal them in and protect them from the weathering stage. And so I'm not re-glossing every part, just any part that had decals on it. So now we can move on to weathering. And for this aircraft, based on all of the reference pictures that I saw, this aircraft is kept in a pretty clean condition. Again, it's a heritage aircraft, so it's going to be making the rounds. It's going to be in the public eye, and they're going to definitely want like a nice clean presentation. So not a lot of grime, not a lot of buildup, not a lot of like corrosion control on this. It's really well taken care of. So for the most part, the weathering is going to consist of basically a panel wash, and I'm just using my favorite, the dark green wash, or the dark brown wash for green vehicles. Gonna go over everything with this, and then we're going to do a little bit of oil work later on, mainly around the engines and the underside surface, where despite all the best intentions, it's still going to get a little bit of grime. And that's going to really be about it. I'm not going to do anything else as in terms of weathering. It just, based on the reference pictures, doesn't really make sense. But I still like to do my little thing here with the panel wash. I know, there's people out there that, you're ruining it, you're not doing it, keep it clean, keep it neat. But it's a stylistic thing that I enjoy. So once the wash has dried, we can go ahead and start removing the excess just by wiping it away with a clean cloth. Don't need any thinner on it. Don't need, it just wipes away directly with the cloth. And, the remains in the nice recessed details and gives us that nice little pop for the panels. If there are particular areas that are a little stubborn, and then don't really want to wipe away, you can use a little bit of Ammo MIG makes like a really mild enamel wash that so far hasn't caused any damage to any other underlying paintwork. So you can use a little bit of that like on a Q-tip or something to remove any stubborn areas. But you can see here with the Alclad Aqua Gloss, the Ammo MIG varnish really just it does exactly what it's supposed to, and I can put it over the acrylic stuff, I can put it over the lacquer stuff, the metallic work, and it just comes right off. That Aqua Gloss is some pretty cool stuff. So just going over, getting everything done on the fuselage, getting this all removed, and so I'm definitely going to maintain like the overall clean look of the aircraft without a lot of weathering, but still emphasize those panel lines and emphasize all that really nice surface detail that the Revell kit has, because it really does have like good surface detail. I think some people might say that the panel lines are a little on the excessive size in terms of its depth and width and stuff. You could almost equate this to Airfix style panel lines, but not nearly as bad. But it fits within what I like and what I like to see, so I don't have an issue with it. But I can see other people maybe like thinking it's a little too much. The JDAMs are really kind of a pain to paint because they have like the blue bomb surface, but then they have this like saddle thing that wraps around it that needs to get painted. Yeah, those aren't fun. But these all get a nice good panel wash as well, and it's time for our final varnish. So again, like I mentioned with the cockpit, I'm not going with a satin finish here. The reference pictures show that this aircraft had a very dead flat finish, very matte, very little shine to it at all. And I don't know if that's just a consequence of the paint that they used, or because they were using this camouflage paint scheme, or if it was like a conscious choice on their part to have zero shine on this. But that's where we're going with our Lucky Ultra Matte here. You'll notice that I've used some Post-it notes to generally cover the metallic areas. I don't want those. I need those to remain shiny, and so just protecting those with the Post-it notes while we go over the rest of the aircraft with our matte varnish, making sure to hit all of the small parts as well, the weapons, the tails, things like that, and get everything all nice and ready for a little bit of weathering. The pylons and the drop tanks, these are going to get a little bit of weathering because they are just normal inventory items, and they're not always carried by this airframe. So I imagine that they would have used whatever pylons, drop tanks they had available to them on hand. So that's why they are going to get a little bit of weathering. But at this point, because I have finished painting all of our paint layers, all of our varnish layers, I can go ahead and remove the masking for the canopies. This is always a moment that I simultaneously look forward to and dread, because I'm constantly worried, like, oh, is there a gap in my masking? Did I get overspray on something? Am I going to have to clean up a nasty paint smudge? But at the same time, like, I get really excited when the masking comes off, because it's like I know that I'm close to the finish on this, and I know that the finish line's in sight, and that just kind of like pushes my motivation to keep going on this. But so overall, the masking came out pretty good. Go ahead and install our engine cans here. So these are basically just press fit into there. And I did put a tiny dab of super glue on there just to lock it in, but they're really not going anywhere once they get in. But really loving the look of those engines and all the paint work we did on those. Very pleased. Go ahead and get the tails installed. Now the tails are the left and right specific. They have different sensors on the very top of the tail, so you do need to be careful that you get the right ones on the right side. So for oil paints here, we're going to be using a little bit of a brown oil paint and then black. So I'm just going to do a little bit of like grime on the underside of the drop tanks. You'll often see like a little bit of buildup on the underside. I don't know if that comes from the way that they're stored, or if fuel comes out and it drips down the side and collects along the center line at the bottom. I'm not really sure the mechanics of how it gets weathered, but you can often find quite a few pictures of the drop tanks with a fair amount of buildup on the underside. I'm going to do a little bit of dirtying up of the practice ordnance as well. I imagine that these are reused often, and so if they're ever like out sitting somewhere, they're going to pick up a little bit of dirt, that kind of stuff. So wanted to add a little bit of grime to those. And now we're just going to do a little bit of streaking on the underside of the aircraft. So basically I am starting this just by applying little dots of straight oil paint onto various areas where I want the streaking to start from. And then what I will do is, using a brush that's pretty loaded with thinner, I will start working that paint back. And what's nice about this process is you can vary how strong and intense you want these streaks to be by doing multiple passes, coming back through with even more thinner. You can essentially like erase it if you don't like how it's looking and start over. So pretty simple. This is kind of just general aircraft maintenance. These engines are gonna leak, they're gonna spew stuff. So even on a well-maintained aircraft like this, you're gonna find these types of effects on the aircraft airframe here. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand paint the canopy seal, or the cockpit sill here. I'd originally contemplated like spray painting this ahead of time, but because I thought I was originally going to be temporarily attaching the main canopy, I left it bare plastic so that I would have a nice clean surface to glue it to. So this is a new thing that I've got here, the gallery metallic markers, and they sent these out to me to try out. And yeah, these are interesting. They're acrylic based and comes in 10 colors. I will be doing like a full separate video on these, but I've been having fun kind of experimenting with them and doing the kind of the gold on the fronts of these bombs here was pretty easy and nice, and they turned out really cool using this metallic marker. Also going to add a little bit of that gold here to the inside of our sniper pod. I basically just like put some of the ink onto my palette and then applied it with the brush because the tip of the pen was too large to fit in there. There's this little metallic vent behind the cockpit that I nearly forgot to paint, so I'm glad that I caught this one before I finished, because that would have been embarrassing. But now we can really kind of just start putting things together at this point. So I was concerned that I would have trouble getting the main wheels aligned onto the landing gear. And so you see here, I'm testing to make sure that they fit on, like the actual hubs fit on first, and then I'll go ahead and assemble the wheels and the hubs together and finally get them on. And I actually ended up just gluing the inside hub directly to the strut, and then gluing the rest of the tire to that. And that helped me to be able to align it properly, get it in the right spot, and get this thing up on its wheels. So hooray for not being a tail sitter. We can go ahead and get the landing gear doors installed. Now I had someone point out to me on Instagram that the nose gear cover, the one that I'm installing right here, would normally be in a closed position, and not open unless it was specifically open for maintenance. So a little bit of a faux pas on my part, but it's all right. The that circular part right between the two engines, that is the APU outlet, and so in a lot of pictures you'll see this kind of cool, unique, like exhaust pattern coming out of there that kind of goes along the two insides of the engines there. So that was kind of fun replicating that, even though once the aircraft is on its wheels, you're really never going to see it, but still looks kind of interesting and unique and kind of a fun wear pattern on there. So yeah, I saw that one in a couple of reference pictures, not of this particular aircraft itself, but like other F-15Es. So now we're going to go ahead and kind of wrap everything up and get all of our little bits put together and start getting everything installed. So we're going to start with the pylons, and kind of a trick that I can pull over from ship modeling is to start like from the center and work your way to the outside, so you're not having to reach over things to install stuff. So starting with the center pylon, get the pylon on, get our JDAM on, and then we can start working our way out. So we've got our navigation pod to install, and this goes into pre-drilled holes on the underside of the intakes. We can install the glass on the sniper pod. So I used the same holographic film on these glass parts that I used on the heads-up display. And so what's interesting too is that these clear parts are cast resin. So I'm impressed with the clarity of the cast resin here. My past experience, clear cast resin has never looked so nice and clear, but I'm really pleased with how they look. I love the holographic effect on this, and yeah, definitely adds a unique look to the sniper pod here. So we can get that installed on the opposite intake. And what a cool thing, those four little rectangles you see behind the sniper pod and the navigation pod, that's where they would put the chaff and flare buckets. So just kind of a unique thing to note there. The drop tanks getting installed onto the pylons. The locating pegs to fit those in were pretty small, kind of a pain. Sidewinder going on. And something I should note about the AIM-120 here, the AMRAAM, is I actually ended up 3D printing those. I thought I had spare AMRAAMs in my collection. I didn't, so I had to scramble and found a $5 file that had AIM-120s in there, and got those printed out and painted up specifically for the kit. So again, having a 3D printer in this day and age can be a really useful tool. So going ahead and getting the arresting hook installed and these little vents installed, and you're going to notice here that I have this red thing on the vent here. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this aircraft, specifically with this display, is show it with a lot of like the FOD covers installed on some of the smaller stuff, because I saw in a lot of the pictures of this aircraft on the ground that the FOD covers would be installed on a lot of these little vents, these little openings, that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to replicate that, and I actually replicated it with using blue tack, poster tack, because I could put it in, shape it to what I wanted, and then put a layer of paint over it, and it creates this nice soft effect that, it looks like they plug these foam FOD covers into these vents, kind of a thing. So kind of pleased with how those turned out, and it's pretty simple. So we can get the rest of our bombs installed here. Again, I really love the asymmetrical loadout of like the GBU-38s on one side, the GBU-12s on the other side. Going to use some Edward, pre-painted photo etch removal for flight tags with ridiculously tiny little loops out of wire, and loop those through the hole in the flight tag so that I can get these installed. So we're going to go ahead and get the removal for flight tags installed on all of the FOD covers that I put on, as well as around some of the Ordinance, and yeah, give them a little twist to show that they're not just completely flat, straight boards. So another thing, in doing the FOD covers for some of the stuff on the aft of the aircraft, I kind of late decided that I wanted to add the covers over some of the antenna on the nose. So I ended up essentially creating new antenna, because the original antenna on the Revell kit aren't correct for a modern F-15E. So I cut them off. I created new antenna with just some evergreen styrene, and now I'm wrapping it with some lead foil, and that's going to represent the cover that they would normally slip over these antennas on the underside of the nose of the aircraft. And I figured, since I was doing that I would also do the FOD covers over the angle of attack sensors. And so I found another file, 3D printed those, and now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good base coat of white and then red to match all of the rest of our FOD cover stuff. So this will really help. I mean, and it's funny that, like, I want to add even more color to an already relatively colorful aircraft, but having the bright red FOD covers on, like, these critical parts of the aircraft, and then having all these remove before flight tags dangling down, really, like, that was definitely like something that I was interested in doing and replicating, and I really like the look of it here. So we can get our antennas installed, the blade antennas installed, and we can start getting our remove before flight tags installed. This is all just getting glued on with super glue, and yeah, definitely really like the look that this is going to give us. Now we can install the pilot's boarding ladder. The ejection seats can finally go in. And so at this point, I mean, the build's practically done. And I really like getting to this point. And usually I end up like just kind of doing like a nice little marathon session right to the end, get it wrapped up, get it done, just because I get so excited to have this one complete and be able to show you the final reveal. So if you've managed to make it this far into the video, I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for going on this crazy journey with me and sitting through an hour and almost 40 minutes now of my rambling and crazy thoughts, but I do appreciate it, and I do enjoy doing this and showing you guys the work that I do, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy making it. So yeah, this was a fun project. Really had a great time with the paint scheme, with the Ordinance, with just the overall look, and it's this is another one of those kits where I had a vision in my mind of what I wanted it to look like, and it pretty much came out exactly how I envisioned it. And definitely a fun one to add to my collection and to put in the display case. And who knows, maybe I'll take it to a show this year, and we'll see how if it can do any good and maybe turn some heads. But anyways, thank you for watching. If you're not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing and hit that thumbs up button. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Tell me what you think. Is it a cool version of the F-15? Whatever. Just give me your thoughts. Give me your feedback, good or bad. If there's areas where you think I can improve, please let me know. I do appreciate the feedback. I try to do better. And finally, I'd love to give a huge shout out to my patrons. I really appreciate all of you for supporting this channel, for supporting me, and helping me to bring this kind of content out to YouTube. I genuinely appreciate all of you. You are amazing. And thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video. Happy modeling.